gesture with his arm as he bowed. "Your chariot awaits, Miss Plummer." He'd winked and grinned, and she'd seen a flash of the dashing young man who had marched off to fight the Great War, rather than the quarrelsome stranger who had returned from it. She'd seized on his sudden lightheartedness and had giggled helplessly as he'd driven them through town, going faster than he should, and needlessly honking at everything and everybody, making her laugh harder. He'd seemed mindless of the jostling until one pothole sent her bouncing so hard in her seat she placed her hands protectively over her belly. "Careful of those chuck holes, or the baby might pop out of me like a cork from a bottle." She had gone into labor that very night. By 3 o'clock the following afternoon, she was a mother and Derby a father. That had been 4 weeks ago. At first, Derby had been prideful and happy and solicitous to her and their baby girl, but the newness of fatherhood had soon worn off, and the grinning man who'd taken her on the joy ride retreated once more behind a perpetual scowl she couldn't delay. In the 30 or so days since Pearl's entrance into the world, Derby had lost another job. He'd spent a lot of time away from the house and snapped at her whenever she'd inquired where he'd been. In a heartbeat, he would become testy and short-tempered. She never knew what to expect. During supper last evening, out of the clear blue, he'd announced, "We're moving to Foley." He'd avoided looking at her by keeping his head bent over his meal. Afraid to overreact, she'd blotted her mouth with her napkin. "I think I've heard of it. Isn't it near?" "It's not near anything, but my old man's found me work out there." She had actually felt a spark of hopefulness. "Really? That's wonderful. Doing what?" "Does it matter? He's expecting us tomorrow." The floor, none too level already, had seemed to undulate beneath her chair. "Tomorrow?" Pearl was a fussy baby who demanded to be nursed several times a night. For a month, Laurel hadn't slept for more than a couple of hours at a time. She was exhausted, worried about Derby's state of mind, worried about their shortage of money, and now this. Leaving half his supper uneaten, he'd shoved back his chair, left the table, and lifted his jacket off the peg near the back door. "Back tonight. I want to get away early." "Wait, Derby, we can't just—" Words had failed her. "Sit back down, please. We need to talk about this." "What's to talk about?" She gaped at him with bafflement. "Everything. Do we have a place to live?" "I wouldn't up and move you and the baby without having a plan, would I?" "It just seems awfully sudden." "Well, it's not. I've been thinking on it for a time." "You should have talked it over with me." "I'm talking it over with you now." His raised voice had caused Pearl to flinch, where she lay asleep in Laurel's lap. Laurel had lifted her to her shoulder and patted her back. Derby's expression had turned impatient, but whether at her, the baby, or himself, she'd been unable to tell. "I've got some things to see to before we clear town. Rent's due on this place the day after tomorrow. I'll leave notice of our departure in the landlord's mailbox." He'd reached for the doorknob. "Derby, hold on." She'd gone over to him. "I welcome the idea of us making a fresh start. I just want it to be a good fresh start. Thought through, not so rushed." "I told you, I have been thinking on it." "But making a move to another town seems drastic. When you talked to Mr. Davis, he told you that he might have an opening at his store soon." "Scooping chicken feed into tow sacks?" He'd made a sour face. "No thanks." "Something else could—" "There's nothing for me here, Laurel. Anyway, it's decided. We're leaving." He'd pulled open the door and said over his shoulder as he went out, "You'd better get started packing." He hadn't returned home until after 2 o'clock in the morning, disheveled and red-eyed, reeking of bootleg whiskey, too drunk to stand without support. When he'd stumbled into the bedroom, he'd propped himself against the door jamb and blearily focused on her where she'd sat in the rocking chair next to the bed, nursing Pearl. "Things ready?" he'd asked in a mumble. Their duplex had rented furnished, so there hadn't been much to pack except for their clothing.